Substantial break here for the Michael Cohen hearings. Only about 5 Democrats left to question Mr. Cohen. Of course, we've seen the strategies unfolding during the day. The Democrats focusing on the most explosive potential claims from Michael Cohen on the WikiLeaks, whether President Trump knew about the WikiLeaks leak from Julian Assange during the campaign, the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal during the campaign, and of course, Michael Cohen's false testimony to Congress over the Moscow Trump Tower. Republicans focusing on Michael Cohen's credibility, on the fact that the hearing is being held at all, and whether Cohen eventually intends to profit from it. But perhaps the biggest news in this last section had to do with something that Michael Cohen could not talk about. He couldn't answer several questions because he said they were still under investigation by the Southern District prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. And then he was asked this.
Is there any other wrongdoing or illegal act that you are aware of regarding Donald Trump that we haven't yet discussed today?
Yes, and again, those are part of the investigation that's currently being looked at by the Southern District of New York.
I want to bring in our senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, for more on that very active investigation right now. Michael Cohen, perhaps a key witness.
Well, George, one of the things that he said is that he's in constant communication with the Southern District of New York. That was news to all of us. We knew that he had been interrogated again by them post his sentencing, but he said he's in constant communication with the Southern District. Also, he pointed out that he was being asked some questions about a contact either between Trump or a surrogate regarding the post time after he was, his home and businesses were raided. So it's clear that the Southern District is still actively investigating some aspects involving the president and or his surrogates.
Okay, Pierre, and some of our stations are going back to their regular program right now. Our analysis continues right here. Dan Abrams, what struck you the most?
Well, the fact that it's in the Southern District of New York. We're not talking just about the Mueller investigation. We now see that at least some portion of an investigation related to Donald Trump himself is now in the Southern District of New York. And that's got to be a real concern for him. That's probably the worst thing, I think, that he's heard from Cohen's testimony from an investigative legal perspective. I think the best thing that he's heard from an investigative legal perspective is when talking about the hush money payments, you have Michael Cohen saying, in essence, that there were 2 reasons that he was doing this. Number 1, to try and influence the election and make sure that this didn't come out and hurt him. But number 2, so Melania didn't find out. Because it is legal for them to pay to prevent Melania from finding out. It is not legal to pay if the goal is to influence the election.
So then it becomes a fight out in court if the prosecution is brought.
Yeah, and listen, as a U.S. attorney who had to make these judgments on folks that were big fish in New Jersey, but not nearly as big as the President of the United States, we had a pretty simple rule. If it wasn't a headshot, you didn't take it. And I think what happened today is there's key witness. It would be Michael Cohen on this issue. And he's going to go up there and say both those things. And if he says both those things, presumably Donald Trump is going to say, no, that was just to prevent it from my wife and my children being damaged by this revelation. And I don't think as a prosecutor you bring that case. I do think that the other thing, and I brought this up earlier, but I think it's important to reemphasize, this is not a hard argument to make. Dan just made it very briefly and very well. The fact that no Republican in hours made that argument is stunning to me.
Do they feel they didn't need to?
I don't know what they were thinking, but I think if they felt they didn't need to, they were wrong. Someone needs to defend the President of the United States here. He's being accused of crimes by a guy who seemingly has inside knowledge of it. But there is an explanation for this, and no one's defending the president. That means either the House did not consult with the White House at all in crafting this strategy, or they did and the White House dropped the ball. But either way, the president, I can guarantee, I know him well, he's sitting in Vietnam right now, fuming that no one's defending.
I wanted to bring that to you, Cecilia Vega. We saw an ally of the president yesterday, Matt Gaetz, come out with that tweet designed to intimidate Michael Cohen right there. We have not heard from the president during this testimony, though we believe he's watching, but we have to believe that given his relationship with Michael Cohen, that what he has heard over the last several hours has him fuming.
Right, and let's just remind our viewers, it's 2:40 almost in the morning in Vietnam where the president is. I don't know that we know, as we're saying right here now, whether this will end up being a bad day for President Trump in his presidency. This is certainly a bad day for President Trump personally. Michael Cohen is pulling back the curtain on what he says it was like all those years in the Trump orbit. He says one of the most shocking things he said to me in this last few hours of testimony, about 500 times, he says the president asked him to threaten people. He says he doesn't give questions, he doesn't give orders, but he speaks in code. And I was in that orbit for so long, I know exactly what that code means. He sounds very much like the same stuff that we'd heard from Comey and from McCabe, that he is making these demands without being explicit.
Well, on that point, I do want to play an exchange he had with Gerald Connolly, a Democrat of Virginia. It was about his testimony over the Trump Tower in Moscow, and it gets directly at that point.
So you had a conversation with the President of the United States about your impending testimony before the House Intelligence Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What was the nature of that conversation?
He wanted me to cooperate. He also wanted just to ensure, by making the statement, and I said it in my testimony, there is no Russia, there is no collusion, there is no deal. He goes, it's all a witch hunt, and he goes, this stuff has to end.
Did you take those comments to be suggestive of what might flavor your testimony?
Sir, he's been saying that to me for many, many months. And at the end of the day, I knew exactly what he wanted me to say.
And why was Mr. Sekulow in the meeting?
Because he was going to be representing Mr. Trump going forward as one of his personal attorneys in this matter.
So it was sort of a handoff meeting?
Correct.
In any way, final question, did the president in any way, from your point of view, coach you in terms of how to respond to questions or the content of your testimony before a House committee?
Again, it's a difficult answer because he doesn't tell you what he wants. What he does is, again, Michael, there's no Russia, there's no collusion, there's no involvement, there's no interference. I know what he means because I've been around him for so long. So if you're asking me whether or not that's the message, that's staying on point, that's the party line that he created, that so many others are now touting, yes, that's the message that he wanted to reinforce.
Terry Moran, so reminiscent of the testimony we heard from James Comey, as Cecilia was just saying. But one of the other things that Michael Cohen has done in those conversations about his testimony over Trump Tower is implicate others. Jay Sekulow. He also talked about Jared Kushner's lawyer as well, Abby Lowell, and whether they knew that they weren't necessarily telling the truth as they edited his testimony. That could be fodder for more hearings.
That's right. As you pointed out, they are now amassing a witness list here. And with every name that Michael Cohen drops, there are more people who are going to have to hire their own lawyers, it sounds like, because he is essentially implicating them in his crimes. But the point of the hearing for the American people are, President Trump and what he has done. And Governor Christie was talking earlier before this last break about running against Donald Trump and finding him essentially bulletproof politically, especially on the issue of veterans. John McCain, that infamous comment. There's the old saying in Chicago politics, we don't want nobody sent. Somebody sent Donald Trump. For whatever reason, there are millions upon millions of Americans who believe he fights for them, and so they're going to fight for him. And until that's broken, I think what we're going to see is what we saw in this hearing, that rock-solid partisan divide. Republicans still staunchly behind him. White evangelical Christians still at 75–80% support. I don't think what we've heard today so far, while it will stir up a lot more activity, congressional activity, I'm not sure it's going to move the dial politically.
That is the politics, Christie. Though the other point that Michael Cohen could not talk about when we went to the Southern District, he was asked about his communications with President Trump following the FBI raid on his offices, on Michael Cohen's offices and homes back in 2017. That suggests at least that the Southern District is looking at the issue of obstruction.
Right, and I think, that's what George had been saying all along, that the Southern District is the much more dangerous thing. And today, America got a preview of that. Prosecutors need tour guides. They're most effective when they have a tour guide through a particular world. Michael Cohen is showing himself today to be a tour guide and have a particular point of view. And when he's corroborated by written evidence, I think he's an effective one. But that last bit of testimony you played in the back and forth, I think that's where he gets himself a little out there. Because when he's saying, I knew, you're accusing the President of the United States of something, and you can't use that. Not effectively, I don't think. So Cohen, you know, I understand what he's trying to do, and he may be very well telling the truth from his perspective. Maybe that is what he thought, but it's very hard to impugn the President of the United States based upon that and for prosecutors to do it.
And don't forget that I think one of the purposes of the question earlier about the conversations after the raid was about a possible pardon. When we're talking about obstruction, I think one of the things they were getting at is, did anyone dangle a pardon? Not just the president himself, anyone connected to the president, related to the president. And that question wasn't answered. That's one of the areas where he's saying, I can't talk about it, because there's an ongoing active investigation going on there.
You can be sure he answered them, though.
Oh,
they
for
know.
sure.
The guys in the Southern, the guys and women in Southern know.
And we have to remember that. Like, what the Southern District of New York knows more than we do now today.
Volumes more, right? I mean, when he didn't answer those two sets of questions, what you now know is he's already answered them for the people in the Southern District of New York. They already know, and they've already been
anything
getting the
he
people.
says he can't answer.
And
he's answered.
And they've asked him not to talk about it.
Right.
Meaning they still think it's important enough and so active that they've said to him, please do not address these questions in front of Congress.
And Chris, how big a threat to President Trump if the Southern District goes inside, crosses that red line that he said shouldn't be crossed, crosses the red line of finances, goes inside the Trump organization?
Well, I mean, listen, they are inside of it already. You heard Michael Cohen talking about Alan Weisselberg, and Alan Weisselberg's
Chief Financial Officer.
Right, a different involvement. Now, you know, this is a guy who has been there since Donald Trump's father was running the organization. Okay, so this is a guy with enormous history. They've already gotten into him. You heard him drop Rona Graff's name, who's his longtime executive assistant. So that red line, in my view, has already been crossed. Michael Cohen's signaling that already by the way he's talking. And I think the other thing we have to remember about this is that the idea, and Terry said before, a lot of people are going to have to get lawyers. They already have them. And there's no doubt that these people, my guess is, have already been contacted in one way, shape, or form, either through subpoena or informal requests to lawyers to start giving information based on what Cohen told them probably weeks, if not months ago.
And remember, there's a difference between short-term risk and long-term risk, right? Short-term risk, you've got to look at Don Jr. and anyone else who's in the Trump organization, et cetera. Is there any kind of immediate risk for them legally based on digging into the Trump organization, et cetera? That's where the Southern District would be working on. There is no immunity for Don Jr. or Jared Kushner or whoever it is. The only immunity here could be for the president himself.
Okay, let's go to Mary Bruce, senior congressional correspondent up on Capitol Hill. You're learning more as you talk to members of Congress about the kind of follow-on they're expecting.
Yeah, George, we've been out here speaking to members of the committee about the groundwork that they seem to be laying here through their testimony, and many Democrats have said that this is just the beginning, that there are many more close to President Trump that they need to hear from here publicly, including several members have told me Don Jr., the president's son. They've also thrown around the name Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, other people who may have been involved in some of these issues close to the president. We've also talked to some of the Republicans on this committee. Not surprisingly, they are continuing to rail against Cohen for his lies. But fascinatingly, they are not speaking still about the substance of Cohen's claims. Jim Jordan, the top Republican on the committee, still refusing to answer questions about the veracity of the documents here presented by Michael Cohen. And not surprisingly, George, Democrats still don't want to talk about impeachment. They say that is simply too soon. They are simply dealing with the facts in front of them today.
Yeah, and Mary, they're staying off of that. I don't know if you've had the chance to ask some of the Republicans as they've come out, but I wonder if you have talked to them at all about the point that Chris Christie was making, this whole strategy they seem to have of not really defending the president in any substantive way, simply attacking Michael Cohen.
Yeah, that is the big question that we are trying to pose here to all of the Republicans as they come out of this hearing. It's very clear that they are in lockstep when it comes to their messaging against Cohen, but they haven't had any response yet to what he's been saying, to these allegations against the president, to the evidence that Cohen claims to be presenting here today. You know, Cohen has said, look, you don't have to take him at his word, that's why he brought these documents. That's why he has these checks. And Republicans so far have been unified in not wanting to take on directly those substantive claims. What they will ultimately say, if we can get through to them, will be very interesting to see, George.
Okay, Mary, thanks. I want to play another exchange, one that Michael Cohen had with Katie Hill, Democratic Congresswoman from California, over the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and the president's involvement.
On February 13th, 2018, Mr. Cohen, you sent a statement to the reporters that said, quote, "I used my own personal funds to facilitate a payment of $130,000 to Ms. Stephanie Clifford, and neither the Trump Organization nor the Trump campaign was party to the transaction with Ms. Clifford, and neither reimbursed me for the payment either directly or indirectly." Was the statement false?
The statement is not false. I purposefully left out Mr. Trump individually from that statement.
Okay. Why did you say it that way?
Because that's what was discussed to do between myself, Mr. Trump, and Alan Weisselberg.
So it was carefully worded?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Mr. Cohen, a reporter for the magazine Vanity Fair has reported that she interviewed you the very next day on February 14th, 2018, about the payment and reimbursement. And she wrote, quote, "Last February 14th, I interviewed Cohen in his office about the statement he gave the FEC in which he said Trump didn't know about the Stormy payment or reimburse him for it. Do you recall this meeting with the reporter?"
I do.
The reporter also wrote, "Trump called while I was there. I couldn't hear much, but he wanted to go over what the public messaging would be." Is that accurate?
It is.
Did the president call you while you were having a meeting with the reporter?
Yes.
Did the president call you to coordinate on public messaging about the payments to Ms. Clifford's in or around February 2018?
Yes.
What did the president ask or suggest that you say about the payments or reimbursements?
He was not knowledgeable of these reimbursements, and he wasn't knowledgeable of my actions.
He asked you to say that?
Yes, ma'am.
So what we have there is Michael Cohen saying the president told him not to tell the truth, told him about those payments. At the same time, Cecilia Vega, you cover the White House every single day, and we know the president was denying any relationship with Stormy Daniels, was denying any knowledge about the payments, including this exchange on Air Force One.
Know about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels? Then why did Michael Cohen make it if there was no truth or allegation?
Well, you have to ask Michael Cohen. Michael's my attorney, and you'll have to ask Michael.
Do you know where he got the money to make that payment?
No, I don't know.
Well, apparently he'd already had those discussions with Michael Cohen.
They've been all over the map on this one from the very beginning. I mean, the president on camera there, his lawyers have been on camera giving various explanations for who knew what when. It really, though, if we all just pause and think about what we're talking about here, the president of the United States allegedly making payments to a porn star to keep an affair quiet. I mean, it just gets back to the remarkable nature of what we're witnessing on a daily basis that has become sort of common practice, that we're just talking about payments to a porn star and covering this White House. And speaking of the porn star, George, Stormy Daniels has a statement out right now that our team just got, and she is, she and Michael Cohen are bitter rivals. She says that he was among those who threatened her many times, and she's now saying, "Thank you for having the courage at long last to begin to tell the truth."
It turned out, Cecilia, thank you, it turned out, Dan Abrams, that there was a lot more talk about Russia than we expected over the course of this hearing. One of the headlines that the president might like from Michael Cohen is that he said no collusion, knows of no collusion whatsoever by the president during the campaign. And the fact that Michael Cohen was willing to talk about it so openly would at least suggest that Robert Mueller's done with him.